I was walking along, minding my business, when love came and hit me in the eye.
Flash, bam, alakazam.
Out of an orange-colored sky.
Hey guys, this is Jimmy. You know, an attitude I've never liked in fantasy, which is not to say that I don't read fantasy with this attitude, is the way that fantasy writers tend to treat gunpowder and cannons, firearms, that sort of thing. Now, I suspect that this has a lot to do with sort of Victorian romanticism and the idealization of chivalry that comes with that worldview. Don't get me wrong, I love the ideals of chivalry as much as anyone else, right? Knights are cool. What knights represent is cool. And unlike a lot of more modern authors, I tend to hold that the idea of what knights were in reality was also cool. Warrior societies are something that have fallen out of favor in the modern day, but I don't think that makes them evil or wrong or primitive. Knights were cool, fundamentally. And I suppose that might be part of why I don't see guns and cannons and gunpowder weapons as being antithetical to the sort of heroic fantasy that we've all come to know and love. I don't think that there is a necessary disconnect between how reality actually was and the heroism and beauty of what the medieval period had to offer conceptually. And you might be wondering what I mean by this. This fear of firearms in fantasy. Well, to give you context, I'll point to a number of famous fantasy works which essentially, if they had been realistic in terms of time period and technology, probably would have had arquebuses or muskets, definitely cannons, and primitive sort of handgun, hand bombard kind of weapons. Other fun stuff like that. Okay, let's jump into it. So example one is Game of Thrones. Now, this is an obvious example, but A Song of Ice and Fire is a series set in what is fundamentally a late medieval European setting. Martin himself is a huge fan of history. He's done so much to bring into this setting a vision of sort of the War of the Roses, which was a dynastic civil war in Britain, if you can actually call any feudal conflict a civil war, since all war at the time was kind of just nobles fighting over their property rights without regard to the idea of nations. Like how the 100 Years' War was pretty much the King of England trying to also be the King of France with the help of those loathsome Burgundian rats. Vive le roi! And in our own historical version of that war, they had guns. You rarely see it in media depicting the time period, but in the 15th century, particularly in continental Europe, firearms were starting to appear all over the place in the West. John Talbot, one of the great English heroes of the 100 Years' War, was eventually killed after having his horse sniped out from under him by a cannonball. Cannons were even being used during the 14th century to attack castles. The British were slower in general to adopt the new weapon, which is part of the reason perhaps why they lost the 100 Years' War, aside from the War of the Roses starting. But there was evidence of cannons and even handguns being used at that time. I think they recently found the remains of some, which was a big find. So what the hell is going on in Westeros? These people have full plate armor. They have pike formations. They have plate-armored heavy horse and more or less every other technology which had been available to Europeans in the 15th century. The gunpowder was simply absent. You know, how is that? Now, I know that there are all sorts of good explanations for this, like there not being a China in the world of Ice and Fire, where gunpowder was originally invented in our own world, or technology being stagnated by the Pyromancers Guild, who hold a monopoly on wildfire, the magical fantasy napalm that they employ to destroy Stannis' fleet in Blackwater Bay. Spoilers. But it isn't really a plot point that no one in Essos or Westeros or Bravos or whatever have any of those... Sorry. But it isn't really a plot point that nobody in Westeros, or Essos, or Ashai, or any of these other places have guns. Imagine if you had a fantasy setting the same way, and it's set, in kind of like this 15th century time period, and they just hadn't ever invented swords. They had spears and maces, but they just never invented swords. You'd expect that to be addressed. It'd be cool to try and make a world like, how did that happen? I'd like to hear it. But it's just weird to me that when it comes to an otherwise very realistic setting with a lot of strong allegories for real-world historical events and technologies and countries and even characters, boomsticks are just strangely absent. It's probably not an oversight. It was almost certainly intentional, but I don't know why that is. Example 2, The Witcher. Now, this is another example of a series that I really like, based off of the writings of Polish author Jan Sapkowski. I don't know, I'm not Polish. The Witcher is a delicious, old-school series of dark fantasy novels that I really can't recommend enough. But these days, most people in the West know about these novels because of a very successful series of video games that were made as a sort of expansion to the stories written by Sapkowski called The Witcher. Now, some people have accused the Satman himself of having borrowed some ideas from a certain bizarre Bongland wizard, comic writer, author, when writing his stories, but I can't really speak to that. I can say that the Witcher series is damn good, and the games are also damn good. One was a little bit sketchy, it was a little overcomplicated, but I thought it was great anyway. The setting and the world of The Witcher is also really good. But I will be verschnookered if they are not also missing firearms. And this one is really conspicuous because the world depicted in The Witcher is even more advanced than the one depicted in A Song of Ice and Fire. The setting feels fundamentally sort of Central European, 15th or 16th century European. I just said European twice. A time period when firearms were really starting to get into their own. The nations all seem to have a loose basis in real-world nations of the time. Nilfgaard is like a combination of Polish resentment for the Swedes over the deluge being combined with their sort of feelings on the Teutonic Order and the anxieties of the Holy Roman Empire, along with some more contemporary issues of German expansionism, being combined to a sort of pan-Germanic nation of highly efficient douchebags obsessed with forms and papers. I thought that was really funny. Temeria, Redoria, and the North represent Slavic European nations faced with the inevitable expansion of the Central European powerhouses. Skellige represents a less negative image of Scandinavians combined with ye olde, woad-slathered Celts. In a setting this anachronistic, with elements drawn from many eras in history, I normally wouldn't criticize the lack of firearms, but in this case, it comes back to the same question. The Witchers have bombs. You know, they might be a secret formula and all that, but Witchers have more or less fully run their course as entities in the setting. You'd think that as the schools dissolved, a few of the surviving Witchers would end up talking to some academics in Oxenfurt, and bombs would have just sort of spread, you know, like at least the idea of gunpowder, and then something from there, you'd at least start seeing some experimental usage of the stuff, maybe really primitive bombs or primitive firearms. It just strikes me as very conspicuous that the setting is so grim and gritty and holds this strong theme of changing times and changing paradigms of war and society, with the Witchers fading from history and magic and elves slowly being pushed to the side as humanity and progress marches on, but guns are just sort of not there. And in every other fantasy story that I can think of with that focus, it's you or even historical narratives that you see a lot. Edward Gibbon was really big on that sort of thing. Guns are the catalyst that pushes magic and mysticism and stuff like that sort of out of the realm, and chivalry to an extent that it is treated as a mystification of war. It's very interesting that is usually the theme. Technology pushing out mysticism. But here you just don't have it. The magic just is still there. The guns never develop, but the same effect takes place. It's a very different kind of perspective, but the strange absence of guns is still as conspicuous as it is, if not more so, in worlds that are supposed to be more purist medieval. Now, the British, when they make fantasy, right, sort of Anglo-Saxon fantasy, that has an excuse, in that the British were always a little slow to adopt firearms going up into the late medieval period, because they already had that tasty longbow span. You know, they had that good stuff going, but firearms were a much larger part of Central European warfare much earlier. And you know, these guys saw what cannons and arquebuses could do, and they jumped on that train the second it arrived at the station. When you think of what was a big war before World War I in Europe, in Britain and maybe in France, you'd probably think the 100 Years' War, or the Crusades. That would be a good one too, actually. But pretty much everywhere else, you'd immediately say, oh, the 30 Years' War, or if you were a Pole, you'd probably say the deluge. If you're a Czech, from what is now Bohemia, or a Slovakian, I forget which of the two it is, you might even think of the Hussite rebellions, which were famous because of Jan Žižka humiliating the entire Roman Empire with some wagons and a few handguns and some peasants with farm equipment. I guess peasants are farm equipment. Oh well. All of those wars were fought with guns, and those guns were important parts of their arsenals, and they were fought a lot later than the 100 Years' War, so it seems strange to see a Polish author reaching deliberately back and excluding guns from a story that otherwise seems more modern than most fantasy, if you understand what I mean. I'm not saying that these authors were wrong for excluding firearms from their work, because, dude, if I were half the author that George R.R. Martin was, well, actually I probably am, the guy's pretty big, I wouldn't be making this video, because I'd be too busy doing a coke outline of Serbia off the shoulder blades of a Russian supermodel. But what I will say is that each generation of writers has to overcome some of the stigmas of the past generations. Part of what makes Martin so popular is that his fantasy feels fresh. It subverts some of the old tropes of the fantasy he grew up reading. And I think this idea that guns don't work in fantasy is something that very much derives from the Dungeons and Dragons era of fantasy, which has somehow remained intact to today with a few notable exceptions. My advice to people who want to write fantasy is, don't be afraid to do the research on historical firearms. They weren't magical knight-killing devices. They didn't instantly turn King Arthur fantasy realm into the ending of The Last Samurai. They were just weapons. Weapons which played an important part in European history, and without which a lot of technologies, troop types, tactics, and ideas which we take for granted in our fantasy may not have existed. Also, shouting fire is a lot cooler than saying loose. Where do you think the fire part came from? That's right, the gun. So, something to consider. All right, folks, that's Jimmy out. I'll talk to you later.
To be able to introduce for the first time ever anywhere the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald J. Trump.